and welcome to the special broadcast. This is the G20 African Union Roundtable from our studios here in India Today Mediaplex. We will be discussing the African continent's importance when it comes to the G20, also as part of the global growth story. To discuss this, I'm being joined over here at the roundtable, Ambassador of Djibouti to India, Ambassador Issa, Ambassador of Sudan to India, Ambassador Al Hussein, and the Honorary Consul General of Comoros to India. Comoros holds the African Union chair this year, Mr. K.L. Ganju. Many thanks for joining us here on India Today. Let's begin with the chair itself, because it is very important to know what the African Union chair is thinking about this entire move and proposal. Mr. Ganju, how has your country reacted to this? The president himself is going to come. What is at stake for Africa over here?
Thank you very much for giving this opportunity to me to represent African Union here. I was in Comoros last time and discussed this issue with the president, and he said we will be very happy if African Union is included in this very G20 session, and that is under process at the moment. I must say, along with that we are so thankful to Government of India for promoting the cause of the Africa and supporting African Union to be included in the G20. And I hope by the end of this summit, the G20 will be G21. I do not know how it will come out after the summit, and but we are hopeful that it will definitely be in favor of the Africa, and African Union will be included in the G20. You cannot ignore Africa, because Africa is a continent of 55 countries. Africa has a population of 1.4 billion. Africa has an economy of more than 3 trillion at the moment. So therefore, the G20 countries must realize that Africa is a place of investment. Africa is full of resources, and African people are very hard-working people. So therefore, I hope, and we will get the result on 10th when the communique is issued after the summit, and we will be happy all together.
Right. Ambassador Al Hussein, they say it's never too late. But do you think that this is a few years too late? The importance of Africa now being seen on the global stage, but it should have been done some time ago.
I only can agree with you. It is true that it should have been a little bit earlier. But anyhow, now it is going to happen, and that is a good thing. My country, Sudan, as a member of the African Union, really welcome the idea of the inclusion of the AU in the G20. And actually, if we recall the establishing of the G20 in 1999, it was established with the main objective and intention of providing an effort to help countries overcome its financial problems and sustainable economic growth and development. With having said this, African Union is very important to the G20 because in the absence of the African Union, the G20 will not be successful in achieving its objectives.
Right.
And as my colleague said, that AU is a group representing of the African countries. African population is over 1.4 billion in 55 countries. Africa also is a resource-rich continent with a GDP of, sometimes said, over 8 trillion American dollars, and with an area of 30 million square kilometers and over 1 million hectares of arable land. So all these facts make it very important for the G20 to be a global organization achieving its objectives to include African countries represented by the AU.
Right. Ambassador Issa, How do you see this, the fact that the conversations have begun, but this is not only this year. The conversations began a while ago. How do you see the conversations develop and evolve into now what we can really see and consider a reality?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, for giving me the floor. I am very honored to be invited by India Today to speak about this very important issue for Africa and for India. And first of all, we would like to thank as Djibouti's ambassador to India and also as chairman of the IGAD countries. We would like to thank Prime Minister Modi for his steady advocacy to promote the fairness, a fair reform of the international system, and include Africa in this in reform of the multilateral system all over the world. And I think it's in that frame that Prime Minister Modi has proposed to be the voice of the Global South during this G20. And we thank him very much to be the voice of the unheard South. And having said that, we know that Africa is one of the most, if it's not the most promising place to invest in the future. And like the European Union, Africa will become soon the 21st member of this G20, and it will be, as European Union, the second multilateral organization that will be part of the G20. And it's about time. It's about time because Africa is the eighth biggest economy over the world. And the eighth biggest economy in the world cannot be absent of the G20.
Right. It is time for Africa. It is indeed time that Africa be included in any of these multilaterals that have a huge space when it comes to conversations on the economic front. There is a huge endorsement that comes from the global community, but Ambassador Al-Hussein, there are some who are also objecting. What do you say to those who are still reticent to really extend support to the African Union? And what are the conversations that you've had, if any, during the meetings where this proposal was put?
Yeah, to start with, actually, African countries recognize and realize the benefits that they can gain from joining the G20. But inside Africa and outside Africa, there is some voices arguing that the African continent challenges are very diversified, and they don't see that joining the G20 will be helpful in overcoming those challenges and problems. But in my opinion, joining G20 will be much and more beneficial for the African continent, African countries. African countries are facing a lot of challenges in terms of climate change, terrorism, financing. It is development projects. And by joining G20, African country will be in a better position to attract this kind of support, whether it is financial or technical. Right. Especially when we talk about G20, including countries has a very good relation and special relations, I can say, with African continent, that is India. And African countries are counting a lot on India to support them in the near future and to overcome their problems in terms of technical support and other kind of cooperation.
Right. Mr. Ganju, have you heard in your conversations of objections to this proposal? We know that there's public endorsement, a lot of them who have come out publicly and endorsed, some who have not publicly endorsed, but is there any country that has actually come out and said, maybe this is not the time?
This is a very tricky question to answer. And, but in all the multilateral meetings, I have not seen anybody objecting to African Union not being included in the G20. But there are some murmurs, like Excellency has told you, what will be the gain of the Africa by joining the G20. But the African Union, in the chair being the president of the Comoros, is of the view that we must join, and there is a support, majority support in African Union to join the G20. Now the question is whether it will happen. Like you said, so many years have passed, every time it was discussed, but this time I see different scenario, because the initiative taken by India, and especially by Prime Minister Modi, is that he is fully supporting it. And there is a news that the US is also supporting it, and there are many other countries who are supporting it. I'm very sure, I told you I'm very sure, I had a lot of discussions with other ambassadors also. It is going to happen this time. If not this time, then when?
That's a very important point. The chair of the African Union, Comoros, represented by Mr. K.L. Ganju, says that it is going to happen this time. That's good news, Ambassador Issa. But again, when I talk about concerns, there are certain quarters who say the influence of China in Africa, should that be a concern for the world body? How will that then start influencing G20 decisions if there's an entire organization that has enough influence from China, coming in from China?
Well, first of all, we have to separate two things. The general talking and the real politics. We know that in this world, in the 21st century, it's impossible that any countries evaluate or evaluate in this world by itself only. This is the time for organization. This is the time for regional integration. This is the time for reunification of many organizations and many countries into organization to go forward. Because the economy became global, because information became global, because everything became global. And because of this globalization, everybody has an interest to be part of our own organization. And it's impossible that Africa, with all this population, with all this potentiality, to be left aside. Otherwise, this progress will not be made by the rest of the world because of migration, because of crisis, because of opportunities, on the other hand, that are present in Africa. Or if Africa is left by the G20, then G20 will be the biggest loser. So Africa needs to be included in every institution because Africa is the continent of the future. That's why Prime Minister Modi also is advocating for a seat at the permanent seat at the Security Council of the United Nations. So Prime Minister Modi has understood before everybody that Africa will be the partner of the century.
Well, that's a very important point that Ambassador Issa makes, that if Africa is not included, it's G20 that stands to lose.
Yes.
But again, Ambassador Al-Hussein, coming to you, concerns. When it comes to concerns, how do you respond to those who are questioning African nations' sovereign decisions? Your sovereignty is yours. If you're engaging another country, you're engaging another country. But to say that you have influence, you're being influenced by one country or the other, how do you respond to that?
Actually, if I understand your question well, in international relations and international politics, always competition are there. And the international community or the international relations invented these multilateral forums to bring all these countries together to discuss their differences and to plan for the benefit of the people of the world. In this regard, or having said this, having different opinions between countries within international organizations and international forums is only natural. And through bringing them together to these forums, that is the right way to let them address, discuss, and find solutions for the challenge. The issue of sovereignty is well understood and well reserved. I mean, the international law recognizes the sovereignty of each country, but that doesn't prevent those countries to cooperate in these multilateral forums.
Right. One of the most important things that we have experienced post the Russia-Ukraine war is food and energy crisis. How did Africa deal with the impact of not just COVID, the pandemic, but just immediately after the food and energy crisis? And how do you see an economic forum such as G20, Ambassador Issa, really look into and cater to the needs of Africa as well?
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, we are human beings, and crises are there to remind us our vulnerabilities. And as human beings, crisis or any kind of problems are made to be overcome. So crises are good because it pushes us to go beyond our limits, and Africa has the necessary means, necessary soil, necessary everything to go beyond the food crisis brought by Ukraine and Russia conflict. It's just a matter of investment and a matter of education, a matter of reinvesting in the human resources. And Africa is full of human resources. So Africa is only lacking actual income, but it will bring its efforts to sort out whatever they need with the help, technical help, and building capacity of the G20s in government members that has already some know-how in this and make a transfer of knowledge.
Right. Ambassador Al-Hussein, the other important aspect is climate change. We have seen the scourge of extreme weather conditions. We have seen how climate change has impacted the world, but certain areas of Africa particularly so. How do you see the Global South raise its voice, and Africa is part of the Global South, raise its voice against those who have had first movers advantage in the West? How does G20 and the African Union come together to fight climate change?
Definitely agree with you that climate change now is represent a serious threat to the planet. And right now, the African countries are holding their summit in conference, on climate change. One of the most problems of the climate change in African countries is that in order for African countries to fulfill their commitments towards the climate change, they need to receive financing. So the inclusion of the African Union in the G20 will go hand in hand with the with one of the objectives of the G20 in climate change.
Okay.
And that inclusion will provide a good opportunity for the African countries to fulfill its commitments and at the same time to receive the necessary finance to do that.
Mr. Ganju, let's begin with how the representation of African Union, what would that really mean for the Global South? And will G20 then represent really the voice of the Global South, taking into consideration concerns of the Global South?
Thank you. Coming back to me, what I feel on behalf of the African Union is, for anything to happen in this world, somebody has to take a lead. So we're very happy that India has taken a lead to have a global south and promote it for the benefit of the continent and the benefit of the global south. So our support to the Global South initiative will be there always, because it will benefit all of us. And once you have a Global South organization per se, you can really become a voice by which you can confront, not to oppose anything, but you can have a power to demand, to power to do things which are for the good of the population of the South.
Well, that's an important point you make, because he's already said that there should be a Global South organization, another multilateral in the making. Ambassador Al-Hussein, would you respond to how the African Union becoming a part of G20 is reflective of, representative of the Global South?
Actually, African Union, by joining the G20, that will make the representation of this G20 more inclusive, more representative, and more influential. By joining the G20 will, instead of representing like 65% of the world population, then it will speak on behalf of the 80% of the planet's people. By joining the G20, the voice of the South definitely will be in a better situation to be represented in this important multilateral forum.
Right.
And again, the African continent and the African countries have shown a serious commitment for the problems that facing the South. And by joining the G20, the African continent will be in a better position to address all those challenges that being faced by the South itself.
Well, Ambassador Issa, the fact that America, China, all these countries that have opposing views, have no consensus when it comes to the joint communique, are coming together on one front, that they are ahead of their presidential visits or the premier coming here, have said that this G20 is going to talk about developing and emerging economies. And the focus is going to be that. So how important do you think then is the G20 to have more of these emerging economies becoming a part of the G20?
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'd like to make a statement here that we believe firmly in the cooperation, South-South cooperation. And as countries of the Global South, we know that there is a solidarity between us. And having said that, we know that things are moving, since things are not the same than last century. Now we have the balance of power are moving after the Cold War, and then after so many events, and now the BRICS, the creation of the BRICS, and now the African Union integrating the G20. So all these factors brings solidarity among all those from the Global South to reach the same level of development of the northern country or western countries. And the objective is, again, the main objective of all our action, the Global South, is to give the wellness to our population,
right,
to fight poverty. This is the ultimate objective. And to reach that objective, it is by cooperating South-South, that by sharing the knowledge, by sharing, India has tremendous knowledge in technology. India has tremendous knowledge in how to develop their medical facilities.
Right.
India is now it became the most populated country. And Africa is where India used to be 50 years ago. So we are expecting to follow the steps of India to become an emerging country.
Right, following the steps of India, but also the objective of the African Union is to ensure that there's alleviation of suffering and eradication of poverty. On that note, ambassadors and Mr. Ganju, many thanks for joining us over here on India Today. Goodbye and take care.
Thank you.